get that reaction a lot in terms of you can't find every bomb, and I'll agree with that up front, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Especially when I was working in the air staff at the time, we couldn't keep track of what we had bombed the previous week, which is what started me on this project. And I asked the question, well, how far back can you actually go? And it turns out it was actually easier to find the data from World War I than it was from the Gulf War, surprising as that may be. Today I'll cover just 3 topics. Air Force officer always going to have 3 topics. Research methods, a little bit on the Western Front, and also on insights from the Italian front. I'm speaking to people that know this better than I. Imagining what would we know if we could know when and where every bomb was dropped from 100 years ago. Is it even possible to know that? What I've discovered is that over the course of 100 years, even though the format and the media that the information is recorded on has changed, the content of the mission report filed after every mission has remained essentially the same. And so the project has been to compile all of those mission reports. Here's one from World War I. This is from the 96th Aero Squadron. With the when, who, how, what, where, and why, I've got those identified, but I won't go through them in detail this afternoon. This is probably an easier way of showing it and how I've grouped the information across all of the wars, how the information gets organized in the big database between the time, the actor, the aircraft. All these things let you identify just what exactly happened, sort of walk back the data to understand what was going on. And we have found that we reinvented this mission report every single combat. It has each World War I invented one, World War II invented one, the British invented one for World War II as well, and we've also invented now the US MTF 84. All of these actually end up being exactly the same. The order of the details may change, but the actual information in each of these reports, independently developed, is exactly the same. So it seems there's some consistency in what we want to know about what we're doing when we're bombing. If you look at what those conflicts look like, this is the number of records we've put into the Theater History of Operations Reports database so far. Great thanks to Steve Sotheby for the French data, which is the majority of the data. You'll see there's 17,000 sorties recorded for World War I. And talking with him yesterday and today, I understand he has even more that I'm eager to get my hands on. So look forward to adding those to the database. Over 1 million sorties for World War II, about 165,000 sorties at the strategic bombing level of the B-29s in the Korean War, and about 13.5 million in the Vietnam War. Everything since Vietnam is still on the classified side, so I won't talk any more about that today. How the information gets into Thor, just a quick overview here. Basically, the sortie flies its mission. They come back and report it on their daily raid reports. Those were all incorporated into the 260-volume Gorell report, which was then turned into microfilm because nobody wanted to publish a large number of those. There's one, I think, all-bound copy still surviving in the Library of Congress. Everybody else has converted theirs to microfilm. The Air Force History Support Office was kind enough to digitize those, microfilm print out those pages for me from the U.S. Aero Squadrons, and then I hand transcribed those into Excel worksheets, and those were then fit into the digital database. That tells us all the textual data, but how do you identify where those missions were flown? I found these maps when I was at the Historical Research Agency in Maxwell, and at first I thought somebody had tried to eradicate the information on them. Only upon closer reflection did I realize these are actual ground traces of the 91st Aero Squadron's visual reconnaissance flights. So they were actually recording the flight path they were drawing, and these are actual map overlays or photographs of map overlays, because when you digitize them and put them on Google Earth, you can actually cover 108 miles or so of the front, 86 of which are covered by the reconnaissance. And this covers St. Mihiel on the right-hand side over to the Argonne Meuse area on the left. So you can see where the density of the aerial reconnaissance missions were flying. Another thing I found was this lovely map. This is a Hachur map of the French planning for the Meuse-Argonne offensive circa about 16 or 18 August 1918. It had a handwritten note on the top of it, paperclip to it, attention Colonel Lom, most secret. And the actual map is a lot more yellow than this. Wonders if Photoshop allow you to restore the color to it. But if you just zoom in on that one little section that I've got outlined in black, you can see the level of detail on the original drawing is just absolutely gorgeous and very detailed. And more importantly, it also tells me the original location names for some of these sites, which have since changed their names and don't exist on any of the gazetteers you can find currently. The little thing you see here, this is a munitions dump And then this area here is positions that the French were identifying of, I believe, their forces, or where they wanted their forces to attack. The areas they wanted the Americans to attack are these areas here that are numbered, and there's a 5-page description on each of those locations of what the targets were and when they wanted to hit them in the attack. So it's not just a map, it's also the plan, one of the original plans for the Argonne Meuse offensive. Because this is so well drawn map, you can actually, again, lay this on Google Earth, and you can drape it over the landscape and see how those lines all line up and actually give you the beautiful three-dimensional effect. And I've exaggerated the vertical relief a little bit to draw that out, but flying through this is absolutely magical. We also happen to have aerial photographs, and this is parts of this one I've seen in much poor resolution. This is the area around Conflans and Jarny. This is taken on 10 o'clock, 16th September 1918 by the 91st Aero Squadron. And the target that everybody was aiming for is the roundhouse here. Interesting enough, I thought originally that Conflans was outside the range of field artillery because it was so far from the lines, but apparently we had one big super gun that was able to hit it, and they claimed that they demolished the roundhouse on the 13th of September. I won't say much about Army artillery at this point, but it's surprising how well and quickly they rebuilt it in just 3 days. I have to wear blue Air Force suit here for a second. It always amazes me that the artillery can fire over 60 miles or whatever onto a target they can't see and know instantly whether they've hit it or not, but they don't believe the photographs we bring back whether or not they actually did that. It does look like there are some large craters to the northwest over here, which are larger than the craters that I believe are placed by the aerial bombing campaign, because the craters that I've seen that are, I guess called medium-sized, they are where the pilot said they dropped them either on the eastern or western edges of the tracks. Interesting, just for, I love this photograph. It's got so much rich detail in it. There's two tents, one here and one down here, with red crosses on them. The square one down at the bottom and the round one up here. The day after this photograph was taken, some bombers from the 96th got a little disoriented because there was a bit of a firefight in the process of getting there. They dropped their bombs and watched them drift, not to hit the tracks, but to hit this Red Cross tent. And unfortunately, yes, it did hit the tent, and luckily the pilots were high enough that the secondary explosions going off immediately thereafter didn't hit them in the process. One of the other details on this graphic is, as I was pouring through it with a magnifying glass and looking at it in detail, there's a series of houses right here, and there's one house right here, right by the tracks, right by the roundhouse that has a whole bunch of craters in its backyard. And the pilots in the 96 speculated that that might have been the German commandant's house, because the day after they missed the tracks and hit his backyard and possibly his house, they were greeted by fighters the next time they showed up in Conflans. So lots of detail in this particular chart, and there are a lot of craters that are around the track areas here. But again, this one too can be used with Google Earth and lined up, and you can start to see, I've got the craters identified over here, but the city center hasn't changed, so you can line it up with the roads and see exactly where these locations are, and then you can geolocate the craters and get 5 to 10 decimal accuracy from Google Earth of where those strikes occurred. So that's how we kind of tie it all together, and I will throw this into a video here because it's not just static. We can now look at time and space and see what that looks like. If I can move it, there we go. If I can turn the sound down too. So this is from August 8th, 1914, all the way through the armistice. French are in white, British are in red, the Italians are in orange over here, and then the Americans are in blue. And this is each strike that we've got reported of the 16,000 or so. And this is with the rotating 120-day window. pause for just a second here. This is the Italian front, and I've overlaid the West Point map of the Italian front here. I believe this is the Battle of Vittorio Veneto we've got here on the ground track. So as we get near the end of the Italian front here, most of the battles begin up here or over here in the mountainous region. You'll see the Battle of Caporetto, all the forces drive down, and then the Vittorio Veneto, you see them break out. Just to give you some context of what you're going to see. So that's what it looks like in motion. Show it back in presentation mode. Give you a little bit more detail what you just looked at there. The planes are at the altitude that the bomb was released at, in scale to the Google Earth. And they're not just dots on a map, they're not just push pins, if you will. If you click on any one of the missions, you get the full mission report pops up on screen for you to review. So it's really fun to zoom through it, watch it, play it, and interrogate it to see what you're actually looking at, identify the units. All the details from the mission report we've hand-typed in there and made them available to you. But this is just one of the ways of looking at the data. You can also sort of integrate the tonnage of bombs, if you will, over time and get what we call a heat map, showing you where the intensity of the bombing was done. You can have a lot of activity, but not necessarily a lot of bombs being dropped or a lot of bomb weight building up. So this is 1918 on the Western Front. We've got a couple of things. The NGA and I disagree with where some of these locations are in terms of lat longs. So again, looking at those older maps to get the exact locations of the towns that have changed their names since then, those will get fixed. But again, this doesn't give you context in terms of the front. If you look at it with the map of the front in place, you can start to see some interesting correlations between where the bombs are being dropped and where the battles are being fought, and perhaps the role that air and ground played together in changing the nature of those battles. I'm going to save some of that for a future talk, but there's lots of very interesting things going on right over here with the German Spring Offensive and the French Air Force, which I will let Steve Sotheby go into in more detail at some later date. One of the other ways you can look at the data is by just looking at it in terms of time on the bottom and then intensity of bombs over time. And this chart struck my curiosity after I started looking at it for a couple of different reasons. One is we go from zero bomb experience on the front as of 6th of June or 23rd of May 1918 to, by the time St. Mihai hell hits, we've got 1,500 planes. We're part of an international armada flying and holding our own weight with countries that have been in the war for 4 years. How did we do that in 90 days? Especially if you look at the bombing squadrons, you only had the 96 for most of the summer doing any bombing whatsoever. And especially since the 10th of July, they flew over the lines and they lost all their planes because the winds were blowing enough that they were forced down behind enemy lines. You may recall the Germans sending a communique a couple days later asking, thank you for the planes, but what do you want us to do with the major? The downside was Major Brown was one of the 2 people in the squadron that had any experience over the lines at that time, and that was only their 3rd mission. So you're left with the squadron with no planes for 20 days, and you've got a lieutenant in charge of your only bombing squadron in the Air Force. So how did we get to where we obviously ended up in just 60 to 70 days' time? Well, I think it takes 2 things. We've already established that Billy Mitchell was brilliant, so we'll say it takes a brilliant general. And he developed the St. Mihiel campaign, and I'm telling you stuff you all know better than I actually forgotten more than I know on this topic. But his 3 topics, or his 3 areas of effect were to blind the enemy, keep the recon and fighters on the ground, attack the aerodromes, isolate the battlefield, lock the enemy down and prevent them from being reinforced, and attack from the west unexpectedly. Now, I know we've all looked at Billy Mitchell and we've understood he's a genius, but we really understood how much of a genius he is, because not only have we never developed a better war plan, but we've seldom developed a different war plan. If you look at Normandy, France, we did the exact same thing. We kept their air on the ground, we kept them locked down in Hedro country, and we attacked unexpectedly where the Germans didn't expect us. In Incheon, the same thing to the Koreans. We attacked from Incheon when they were expecting us to break out from Busan. And again, in Desert Storm, we had the western right hook, if you will. In Saddam Hussein's defense, in Operation Iraqi Freedom, he was expecting us to come from Jordan because he knew we were going to attack from the west. The only time we tried to do it twice on the same guy, so we attacked from the south that time, and that's part of what got him to be so confused in Baghdad. But it turns out the general can't do it alone. You've got to have someone else to implement the general's plan, to actually give you the trained force to execute the general's plan, and I call that person the most important man in the history of the Air Force. Now, without a person to actually train the individuals how to bomb, all we have is a very expensive flying club. So we left, of course, the most important job in the Air Force to a lieutenant, not just any lieutenant, one very specific lieutenant, and I know you all have a name in the tips of your tongues, in the back of your heads. You think you know who this lieutenant is, and I'm going to throw it up here and see if anybody actually knew this one. Did anybody get a guess? Andre Gundelach. Oh, gosh, well, there goes the surprise. So going through the records and trying to figure out why the 96 was able to bring itself to be a combat power, I found some details about him that surprised me. I thought were very interesting, and also interesting in terms of what they portended for the Air Force. He started out as a sailor in the Great White Fleet, sailing around the world in 1907 to 1909. So before we had an Air Force, the most important man in the Air Force was Joint. He served with the Lafayette Flying Corps in the 95th, the Swan Escadrille, and the 111th Escadrille. So we were coalition and joint before we were effective Air Force. And then he joined the Army Air Force. There was a month overlap between the French and the Army service. I'm not quite sure exactly how that works. But he went and then was training at the Aviation Instruction Center and went on to join the 96th in May. Killed in action on the first day of St. Mihiel, taking a mission that he felt was too dangerous for anybody else in the squadron to take, and took off overloaded with bombs, was able to provide relief to the Americans that were pinned down at a crossroads, but then was attacked by 8 German aircraft and was shot down, plane on fire, landing just short of the river. He lived a few hours after the crash, but his observer was dead at the scene. But why is that all important? Is because he invented American bombing tactics. He created a new 7-plane formation, which was lucky. The planes that we were given, the Brugades, didn't have the same fields of fire as the British formations, and the British and the French had more planes, so they had different formation tactics to cover blind spots. He developed a 7-plane strategy to cover the blind spots in the brigade, and also because we had 7 planes. He enforced formation flying, according to reports from the squadron members that were interviewed after the war. No one was allowed to break formation. Once you crossed the lines, if you were in the formation, you were in the formation all the way to the target. Well, one of the things that annoyed him while he was flying with the French is 21 planes would take off, but when it came time to bomb the targets, there was him and maybe one wingman that had stuck around to actually get to the target. So there's stories from one of the lieutenants that flew with him that it was the first time over the lines, and he was getting a little nervous. He looked back at his observer. They sort of nodded heads, and they sort of started easing back. And apparently Andre whipped around at that point. His helmet was already gone. He started shaking his fist at him. There's a couple different stories here, but I think Andre's observer swung the guns around on this particular flight. They pulled back in. The other thing the reason they were getting nervous was because they were flying through flak for the first time. So what happened after that was that Andre led the entire formation to the flak 5 to 6 times. So they lost their fear of it, but not their fear of him. It seems to be effective. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that he taught them coordinated defensive firepower, using all the guns in the formation to aim at the same target. Originally, you have to do this because the guns freeze up at 14,000 feet. It's cold up there. If you don't fire them every couple of minutes or so, just a round or two to keep the things heated up, you'll get a seizure, and then your guns will fail right when you need them most. So at first, they're firing at random, and then they start to synchronize it and aim at little clouds. And part of their fighting, their fear of flak, they started firing at the flak all at once to see who could hit it the closest and the best and everything like that. And this worked out really well when the flaks were placed with fighters coming in to greet them in their time over German territory. So the German fighters were very surprised to see this formation actually all firing on them all at once. The other thing he taught was advanced land navigation. On the days that they didn't have planes or it was raining and they couldn't train, he would cut up maps and photo maps into squares and put them in a hat, and they would have to pick a square out of the hat, identify where it was, put it on the table, and draw the 8 squares around it from memory. This trained them to know the terrain, so if they got a hole in the clouds and saw only one little glimpse of the land, they knew exactly where they were. I think that was adopted by others, so I can't prove it at this point. And more importantly, but through all these things, he taught his fellow pilots to think like wingmen and think like think like a team, think like a formation. And this carried on after his death. And sorry, I think I've got one on McCrae, but it isn't one of the ones on here. And I'm not going to read these out loud for time reasons, and also I get choked up every time I read these. But these are some of the individuals from the 96 that carried on that example of selflessness and commitment to the formation and commitment to the mission, even after Andre Gundelach died. I'll give you all just a second more.
I'm sorry, I haven't gone through the speed reading course yet.
I'll put this one up after if you wish to read them in detail. Anyway, the key factors are his legacy lived on after his death, and these tactics were studied and adopted by the ACTS and Maxwell and became the foundation of U.S. daytime precision bombing doctrine in World War II. He learned other lessons too and taught other lessons. Some of the reason these were not adopted, which were that enemy fighters will always attack the bomber formations. Bombers need fighter escorts to survive in a non-permissive environment, and we had to relearn those lessons at great cost in World War II and again in Korea. You saw those little bits on the Italian front I talked earlier. Let me just touch briefly on those. This is the other thing I found was interesting in terms of looking at the data and trying to understand what it meant. I come to this whole project not as a historian because I don't have a background in history, but I come into it from a background of data and looking at the data and looking for anomalies in the data. And this one struck me as being a bit anomalous. Army doctrine at the time said anything beyond the range of artillery, which is around 14.4 miles at the time the document was written, was considered strategic versus tactical. So that's kind of how the Army defined its battle space, from what I can understand. That's the little circle we've got here. The little white circle is about the 14.4 mile mark. So if that's the case, what are these pilots, especially American pilots, doing all this distance far beyond? This is up to 40.4 miles beyond the front. What are they doing that far behind enemy lines? And it turns out, if I escape that, there we go. They're doing deep strikes on transportation targets, hitting every rail junction, every bridge, every railroad station, deep behind enemy lines and preventing the Austro-Hungarians from doing any reinforcement of their forces at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. I'm sure many of you are well aware that's where morale at that point on both sides was terrible. And the fact that the Italians were actually having positive gains on the battlefield and the Austro-Hungarians were not, and they were also not having any reinforcements, food, bullets, or people coming from the back lines, was probably a consideration in the 300,000 plus POWs that were captured from the Austro-Hungarian forces. Now, that massive battle and that massive amount of POWs led to the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire just days later. And this was around the 29th of October, 1918. By 3 November, Austria-Hungary is split apart and signing separate peace agreements with the Allies. And one of the key provisions of that is that the Allies have right-of-way on the Austrian railways and unimpeded access to those railways to be able to start a second front on the south part of Germany. So I think that also weighed into Germany's calculus by the 11th to declare the ceasefire and the armistice. And I'd like to say that all draws back to these few American pilots in Caproni bombers there on the Italian front having an outsized impact for their actions. I did it again. There is one more thing. Again, I come to this from a data perspective, and I have friends that are also data geeks, and one of them happens to be a specialist in geekiness. I can say that because I asked him. And that is, what if you knew the weather the pilots were flying through? I mean, there's no way we would know the weather. Well, it turns out, actually, there is a way. There's a database out there called the 20th Century Reanalysis database, and it has 14 different parameters: wind speed at altitude, wind speed at ground, wind direction at altitude and ground, temperature at altitude, temperature at ground, dew point, relative humidity, icing potential, precipitation, thunderstorm potential, percentage of cloud cover at low, medium, and high altitudes, percentage of lunar illumination, and percentage of snow cover on ground. And that's with any given position, even back to 1914, within a few kilometers of where you report the position, within a few hundred meters of altitude, and within about 20 minutes of the time you specify. So if you wanted to look at anything in terms of okay, we know the takeoff point and the landing point, or the drop point. We can actually see how well this lines up. And this is the British and American records from 1917 to 1918, Battle of St. Mihiel. I just pulled one mission that was on 1800 Zulu on the 12th of September. Total darkness, very poor and rainy, were the conditions specified by the pilot report. And when we plug it into the database, this is the data that comes back. I did think it was interesting that right about the time St. Mihiel kicks off, the winds get much worse. They jump in speed by about 10 knots, 10 to 15 knots, which is typical in France in September and in October. But literally right when the mission begins to kick off, the weather goes south. And you can see it again during the Argonne Muse period as well. You also have high winds. So in conclusion, American bombers were integral to strategic interdiction on both the Western and Italian front, even though we didn't have the term strategic interdiction. In fact, even though they invented strategic interdiction there on Vittorio Veneto in 1918, even by 1943, after the 9th Air Force had been doing the same thing in the Mediterranean, doing strategic interdiction, they still didn't have a term for it. When they were trying to describe it to headquarters, they had to use a naval analogy of a naval blockade to try to explain air interdiction to an Army officer. So I guess that's jointness in its best. The U.S. bombers would go deep into enemy territory and bomb critical junctions and shut down the enemy's ability to move forces, reinforce the battlefield. And there was a briefing I heard about a year or so ago from a professor at King's College in London, showing the 100 days of the last 100 days operational campaign for the World War I, and the Allies planned to do the Argonne Muse offensive type thing, starting actually in July. And he had this one phrase. He said, for some reason, the German rail system, which had always backed up its ability to reinforce its line, for some reason it failed right when it was needed most during this period. And he put up a chart showing when the rail system failed them. And I had my chart you saw earlier of all the attacks. And by goodness, the days lined up, and I knew the reason. So he was very eager to see that data as well. And I think we've already mentioned the key battles and the ability to overwhelm the local support there. There is one last thing I want to share with you, just because I think I'm a geek, and this is a picture I find very fascinating. I have the date slightly wrong. There's a typo. It should be 10, not 19 January. But this is Koblenz in January of 1919. You can see all the trench works and the revetments here on the ground. You can see the aircraft hangar that's been put up. And this picture, or another one very similar to it, shot in the same role, is on the wall in the World War I gallery. You can take a look at it there. This is the top half of a square of aircraft that were set up as a parade ground that day. What I find interesting about it is looking at you have a band down here, you have dignitaries, and you've got a line of people being honored here. When you zoom in on it a little bit, you notice a couple things. One, these aircraft over here are not American. Those are German aircraft. I believe they're D-7s, but I defer to the experts on that. And it looks like some of these people over here are not in American uniforms. It doesn't really show well on the screen here, but when you look at it in a magnifying glass, it does look different than the rest of the uniforms over here, which are American. And then you have the crowd being honored here. When you zoom in on that, it turns out I was able to figure out what this was. This is the 91st Aero Squadron, those guys that did the scribble maps earlier in the brief. They are receiving, all the surviving pilots are receiving the Distinguished Service Cross for actions in the war. And this is the big ceremony. Everybody was called forward to this because you have Billy Mitchell there presenting the medals that day. And the way I see it, I see this man reading off the awards. That's probably the proffer. And I'm pretty sure that's Billy Mitchell right there. And so the idea of Billy Mitchell being captured in an aerial photograph strikes me as being extremely interesting and sort of recursive in a certain manner of way. He's recorded in an aerial photograph presenting medals for aerial bravery and heroism by flying into the battle, taking pictures, and he's captured by that same activity. So with that, I leave it for any questions for you. The address for the Thor database is on the screen, and you don't have to write it down. I also got cards over by the flag over there that you can grab a copy of if you wish to. So with that, I defer to your wisdom and judgment.
Jens, come into it real quick. Your data, did you include the non-independent Air Force British bombing missions, like 205 squadrons? 25 RAF?
When I had it, I did. So I'm agnostic in terms of data. If I have data, I put it in with a caveat. I don't claim it's inclusive until someone can tell me there's no more data out there. Okay. So if anybody, let me put out the plea, thank you. If anybody has any data, mission reports or anything like that, and we don't already have it, or if you don't know if we already have it, please send it, again, to the email address on the card. I will be glad to include it and get it into the system, because I'd like to have a very comprehensive view of what happened in the war, and not just this war, but all the other wars as well. Thank you. Next question? Yes, go ahead.
In regard to Gundy Gundalach, I was not aware of just how important to battle theory he was until you brought these up, but I have written on the man otherwise in terms of his actual career, and I'll happily trade you a copy of my article on him for that list of technical innovations that he advocated, which from my part will include a breakdown of what units he served in. 95 is actually N95, and it was a fighter unit, not...
Yes.
He scored a victory while he was in it before he switched to bombers. It was BR-111 that was the so-called Swan unit. And I believe that a well-known photo of a Breguet with an odd device behind the Swan is his. And it's actually an American sort of shield device in U.S. colors.
Deal.
We'll talk.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask
Go ahead.
you, what was wrong with Goering's Luftwaffe bombing strategy in World War II? The Battle of Britain and so on.
I think we have another meeting for that. Short answer is there's a number of different theories that are of what caused the German strategy to fail. I think part of it is the failure to develop a 4-engine bomber to be able to carry the loads heavy enough to actually do significant damage per raid. But I've also discovered some interesting things about the British RAF defenses after the Battle of Britain that prevented any future Battle of Britain type of attacks. That isn't really, at least what I've been able to find, not well documented in other reports. It was sort of accidental. They reported what they had to go through to land the 8th Air Force planes back in Britain without getting shot down by the defensive caps that were being flown.
Thank you.
So, yes, sir.
Yes, the weather information you had, how wide-ranging is that geographically? And is it throughout the whole war?
It goes back to 1870. I'm not the weather guy, so any detailed requests for weather things, I'll throw to my friend Lee, who actually queries the database, because it's all in weather terms that when he tries to explain to me, my eyes glaze over. I just say, look, what was the wind speed? It is global to a point. There are gaps as we go further back, obviously, but Northern Europe is well covered. America is well covered. So from 1870 onward, we've got a pretty good data coverage. There are a couple pockets here and there, but I can ask him what the exact coverage is. I know it goes by World War II. It's global.
Well, I mean, is this through Thor or through a?
It's through a NOAA database. So my friend Lee has already written the script. So if we give him the data from Thor in question, he can immediately plug it in and get the answer back. So I can get you the website for it, but it's a little complicated and weather-centric.
Okay.
Other questions? Yes, go ahead. Sorry, thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering if you've looked at any corroborating reports from the enemy in terms of damage, and also what do you do about cases where bombs are dropped through cloud or bombs are dropped in a panic when there's attack from fighters, so they're not being dropped on the original target?
That
or
is
into the ocean even.
That is a location known as unidentified. And the data's in there, but there's no long coordinates given in the database. So you can see how many bombs were carried that day, but not necessarily found against the target. I'll jump forward just a little bit to the strategic bombing server in World War II, and actually the second highest category after Berlin, which had 103 kilotons of bombs dropped on it. The second highest category was unidentified, which had about 102,000 tons of bombs dropped on it as well. So that's been a continuing problem. And as I mentioned earlier, there's craters in confluence allow me to identify locations there better than I can in the Gulf War of '91, where I only have a 10 by 15 mile square that tells me there's a bomb somewhere in that region.
And are there German reports of where bombs fell?
I'm sure there are. I have not found them. I haven't looked for them. Basically, this was the point, and it was it kept me busy enough up to this point of trying to get the American and then the Allied records. I've heard tell in just the brief time we've had this conference of possible location of German records in the National Archives that I want to go follow up on. Is there another question out there in the back?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Maybe my eyes are playing tricks on me, but when you ran the animation, it looked like there was a strike someplace southwest of Bern, Switzerland. Is that true?
It could be one of the misidentified locations
Okay.
that I've gotten there. Apparently, it's the American equivalent of Springfield. And I was using the official National Geospatial Agency's gazetteer for all lat longs, and apparently some of these towns have changed their names since World War I, and there's no connector between the current name and what it was previously. So there's about a handful to 2 dozen that I need to go back and do a little bit more detailed digging on and look at older maps to find them.
Great.
Yes, sir. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
To answer your question, there was an American bombing survey that was done in the first few months after World War I ended in the occupied Rhineland, in which U.S. Air Service personnel went around to a number of different towns. They spoke to mayors, railroad officials, factory officials, and they collected a huge amount of data on what those people had for information on bomb raids. And so it's simultaneously very detailed and also very spotty. Some places they couldn't get any information at all. So there is data out there. That data is actually in the Gorel files the National Archives holds, and I've put it into a spreadsheet. But it's I don't know if it's probably it's thousands of records. And so there is such data out there. The British also did a bombing survey that was similar, but I have not, but except for a few anecdotal things, I have not seen information from it to be able to use.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What percentage of the bombs were duds?
Excellent question. I don't have a good answer for you.
What percentage were accidents on the ground while they were loading ammo?
That would be another explosion.
Again, excellent question, and I don't have good data on that. All right, if there's no other questions, am I missing any hands to the glare? All right, thank you all very much.